Today we are going to talk about the Shroud of Turin. Nora, who is a Shroud educator, who travels all over the country in order to present on the Shroud. The National Funeral Museum is going to have a wonderful exhibit that Nora is personally involved in on the Shroud. And the coolest thing of all, on the burial of Jesus, and the coolest thing of all is it's right here in Houston. This wonderful exhibit. She's going to talk more about that later. So let's give her a St. Anthony of Padua welcome.
So I like to start my presentations by showing people a piece of fabric that is the approximate dimensions of the shroud, because people are always amazed at the actual size of the shroud. It's almost 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. So it is a very large piece of fabric. And so this is usually something that really surprises people, because a lot of people think of it just maybe as a face cloth or a handkerchief size. And so we're going to put it down here, and Michael has volunteered to come and help me demonstrate for you. And if you can't see in the back, I recommend that you stand up, because this is very important for understanding some of the very important characteristics of the shroud. So when the body was wrapped in the fabric, the body was laid at one end of the fabric, and then it was brought over the head and then brought down over the feet. So you can see that it drapes over his body. And I want to just point out a few things to you here that you'll notice. So you can see right here, the fabric touches Michael's nose. You can see that it drapes around his shoulders. You can see his fingertips here. And you can see that his feet stick out from the fabric. Yes, he's a good model for me here. So I just want you to have this in your mind as we go through the rest of the talk. And so you'll understand that what we have imprinted on the shroud is a head-to-head image, and it's on the inside. So you'll see that we have, if you'll go back to that, thank you. Thank you, Michael. So I'll show you a lot of pictures of the shroud, but I just wanted you to have that visual image. And the word shroud means burial cloth. And the reason why we call it the Shroud of Turin is because it's been in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. The shroud was folded up, and it was in a silver reliquary box in a church in Chambéry, France. And the church caught on fire, and there was a piece of molten silver from the reliquary box that dropped on one edge of the shroud. And so that molten silver melted all the way through the fabric. So when you open the shroud up, it's like when you cut a snowflake out of paper at Christmas time. There is a repeating pattern that goes throughout the cloth. For the beginning of the presentation, I'm going to talk only about the science and history of the shroud. And this information is going to be the information that is widely agreed upon by historians and scientists. The Shroud of Turin is the most studied artifact in the history of the world. I'm going to say that again. It is the most studied artifact in the history of the world. So there is a lot of settled science around the shroud, a lot of things that people agree on. If there's information that I'm going to share with you that is a theory, then I'll be careful to point that out, that this is a theory. But everything I'm going to be talking about at the beginning here is what is agreed upon by scientists. So let's just start with an understanding of what the shroud is. So as I've already mentioned, it's a linen cloth. It's about 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide. So I talked to you about those burn marks. So these triangular patches that you see repeating throughout the shroud are from the repairs that were made as a result of that fire in 1532. Let me just back up and orient you to, this is the shroud cut in half. So this is the front image, and this is the back image of the shroud. So it's the long 14-foot fabric cut in half so that you see the front and the back at the same time. So we see those burn marks, and these lines, these parallel lines that go throughout the fabric, those are scorch marks from that 1532 fire. So that's the most prominent thing you see, the burn marks and the patches. There's also some repeating water stains on the shroud. There's one here at the knees. There's a very prominent one in the abdomen area, and then it repeats again on the back and behind the legs. So at one time in its history, the shroud got wet, And it was either when they were trying to put out the fire, or it could have been when it was submerged in water and some of the water wicked up through the fabric itself. There is blood all over the shroud. Some of the most prominent places where you see the blood are on the forehead. There's a very prominent backwards shaped number 3 or epsilon on the forehead. There's big blood stains in the wrist area and at the feet. And then the biggest blood stain is at the side. And that blood goes around through the back and goes across the middle of the back. Finally, the thing that is most difficult to see on the shroud is a very faint image of a man. And that man has been scourged brutally. He's been crowned with a cap of thorns. He's been nailed through his wrists and through his feet. And he's also been pierced in the side. We're going to talk about all of these things in a lot more detail. So the cloth itself is a linen cloth. So linen is an organic product. It comes from the plant, the flax plant. And in first century, they would grow the plant and use first century techniques to weave it. And this particular fabric is woven in a herringbone weave. And that's a 3/1 twill. And the thing that we would have today that would be most like that would be your Levi's jeans. They're a herringbone twill. And the reason why this is significant is because typically first century woven goods were just a 1-to-1 weave. This 3-to-1 weave was much more difficult and therefore much more valuable. And this kind of linen would have been very expensive, along the lines of silver or gold in the first century. And we know this is consistent with what the Gospels say, that Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man and that he's the one who bought the linen that wrapped the body of Jesus. The image on the shroud is very faint. In fact, the image is only 15% darker than the background of the shroud. And the image is extremely superficial. So these threads that compose the linen, they're made up of fibrils. So one thread that's woven into that 3/1 herringbone weave is made up of these fibrils. Up to 200 fibrils make one thread. So in the image area, the depth of the image is only about 2 or 3 of these fibrils. So it's very, very superficial. So a better way to illustrate this is if you took one of your human hairs and you cut it in half, and you took that half and laid it aside, and you took the remaining half, cut it in half again, the image area is only that thick. It is less than 2 nanometers thick. So if you took a razor blade and scraped it across the top of the linen fabric, you would completely remove the image area. So it's completely superficial. I have some slides here that show a close-up. You can see those little hair-like fibrils. And what's really unique is that there are areas where there's image area on one of those very tiny fibrils next to a fibril that has no image at all. The image does not seep through the fabric. It's not visible from the other side of the fabric. And as I've said, it's just completely superficial. In contrast to that, the blood stains soak through the fabric. The blood stains have that capillary action that you would expect. So in an area where the blood touched the fabric, it seeped through. You can see the blood from the reverse side of the fabric. And the blood has been studied by scientists, and they've drawn some conclusions about it. They've said that it contains hemoglobin, and it contains a protein called serum albumin. And the other thing that they have noted about the blood is that it has retained its bright red color. So even though this blood is centuries old, even to this day, it's very bright red. And that has led some skeptics to say, well, surely this can't be real human blood, because we know that after a few hours, blood usually turns brown or black. And this blood has retained its bright red color. But there was a study that was done, and the reports came out in 2017, that when a victim of torture sheds blood, the blood contains high levels of creatinine and also of bilirubin. And so when there has been a polytrauma, that blood remains bright red, and it remains red over time. And so that was something that was just recently reported. The other thing about the bloodstains is that scientists have determined that they were on the shroud first. So the image came after the bloodstains were on the shroud. So underneath the bloodstains, there's no image at all. There's the blood seeps through, but the image is not in the bloodstained areas. So what do we know about the man of the shroud? So scientists have been able to reconstruct what the man of the shroud looked like from the information contained in the shroud itself. He was between 5'10" and 6 feet tall. He weighed 170 to 180 pounds. He was muscular. He was well built from working hard. And he has Jewish or Aramaic features. He has almond-shaped eyes. He has a long nose. And he has a beard. And the center of the beard shows an area where the hairs have been plucked out. There's a separation in that beard. I've heard Jewish scholars talk about the image of the man, and they've said that the most Jewish thing about the man of the shroud is his hairstyle. And in the time of Jesus, in the first century, the Jewish rabbis would wear their hair with a ponytail in the back. And the man of the shroud has an unbound ponytail, and then also the forelocks in the front, like we still see today with the Hasidic Jews still wear those forelocks. So what do we know about the history of the shroud? Well, the history before 1355 is still being reconstructed. This is something that historians are actively working on. And I can tell you that there are some theories about the shroud before 1355, but it shows up for the first time in recorded history in a small town in Lille, France in 1355. So if you want to talk about the history before then, this would be something we could talk about during the question and answer period about some of the thoughts about where the shroud was before it showed up in recorded history. So it shows up in this little town in Lille, France, and a widow, through time, it ended up with her granddaughter, and this granddaughter was looking for a custodian for the shroud because it needed to be in safekeeping. It was a time in Europe when there were a lot of wars going on, and so the granddaughter was looking for a home for the shroud. But she was also very shrewd because she traded the shroud to the House of Savoy for 2 castles. And so at that time, in 1453, the House of Savoy, which was the ruling family in the southern part of France and the northern part of Italy, they took ownership of the shroud. And for about 50 years, that family traveled with the shroud with them. And they used it as a dynastic symbol. So it was to show that God had blessed their family with the right to be the rulers of this area of Europe. So in the 1500s, they built this chapel in this little town of Chambéry, which is also in France, and that is where that terrible fire broke out in 1532. And as I mentioned, the shroud was folded up and it was stored in a silver reliquary over the altar, and the fire was so hot that it melted that reliquary. And the melting point of silver is over 1700 degrees Fahrenheit. That's how hot this fire was. And yet, the image area of the shroud was not damaged in that fire. There was some damage in the shoulder area, but the face of the shroud was preserved. So here you can see where that burn area was in the shoulder area. So the Savoys decided to move the shroud to their capital, which was in the city of Turin, in Turin, Italy. And so they built their palace, and then they built the cathedral, and in between the palace and the cathedral, they built a special chapel. And that was the chapel that was built to house the shroud. And again, this was to solidify their role as the dynastic leaders of that area of Europe. So the shroud was moved in 1578 into this chapel in Turin, and it has been there ever since. There was a short time during World War II when it was hidden away for safekeeping, but other than that, the shroud has stayed in Turin, Italy, in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. It was also in private ownership in the House of Savoy for all of this time. So we move quickly through modern history, and we see that in 1898, the Savoy family was having a celebration, and they wanted to honor the people who were being married in 1598 by having a special exhibition of the Shroud. And the photography had just been invented about 40 years before that. So they hired an amateur photographer by the name of Secunda Pia, and you see him here with his very large camera. And so Secunda Pia came into the cathedral, set up his scaffolding and his giant camera to take photos of the shroud, and you can see the image that he took is on the left-hand side. Now this is a photographic negative. So when Secunda Pia took his photo, he was taking black and white photos, and you'll see on your left-hand side, that is what the black and white photo that Secunda Pia took looked like. But when he was in his dark room and he had his big glass plates where he was developing the glass plate in his photographic solution, the photo on your right is what emerged out of that solution. So what Secunda Pia realized is that the image on the shroud that you see with the naked eye has qualities of a photographic negative. So the lights and the darks are reversed. But when he had the photographic negative, it became a positive image. And so he saw this image for the first time. In his memoirs, he said he nearly dropped the glass plate because he realized that for the first time in almost 2,000 years, the face of Jesus. And so he showed this photograph as a result of this exhibition, and he was widely criticized because skeptics said he must have done something to come up with this image. And it wasn't until 1931 when a professional photographer was hired, and he took a photograph of the shroud, and this is his photograph here. The one on your left is what it looks like with the naked eye. And then the photograph by Henri, the professional photographer, on the right. And that original Italian amateur photographer, Secunda Pia, was still alive in 1931 when this photograph was made. And he said he was the most relieved person in all the world that Henri had gotten the same results that he had with his photograph. So this photograph in 1898 inaugurated a whole new era in shroud studies, and it became a subject of scientific study because people realized for the first time that this image was very mysterious and it had qualities that people wanted to understand. So there began a period of scientific study. So in the 1930s, a French scientist, a French doctor by the name of Pierre Barbet, started doing studies on cadavers. And his results were published in the 1950s in this book, A Doctor at Calvary. And what Pierre Barbet started doing was crucifying cadavers. And the reason why he did that was because he wanted to understand the mechanism for crucifixion. Because we've all seen many, many paintings from the Middle Ages of crucifixion. But crucifixion was actually outlawed by Constantine in the 4th century. And so from the 4th century until now, people didn't really understand how crucifixion worked. And so Pierre Barbet started doing his studies because he wanted to see if a nail driven through the palm of a human hand could support the weight of a human body. And what he discovered was that the weight of the body would rip through the palm of the hand, and it could not sustain the weight of the body. And so what he recognized is that the shroud shows the nail wounds in the wrist area, and that this was a very accurate way where someone could be crucified and it would support the weight of the body. Also in the 70s, this Swiss criminologist named Max Frey had the idea of taking sticky tape samples of the shroud and seeing what he lifted off. And you can see in this photo, he actually took what looked like a Scotch tape dispenser, and he put it down on the shroud, pressed it down, and then lifted it off, and then took those sticky tape samples and looked at them under a microscope to see what he would discover. Now, Max Fry is very famous in Europe because he was noted for analyzing crime scenes. So he would look at crime scenes and use his detective's eye to try to understand what had happened there. So he applied that same methodology to studying the shroud. And on these sticky tape samples that he took, he found pollen and dust. And the pollen and dust were used to help to fill in the information about the history of the shroud. Because remember, we don't know for sure where the shroud was before 1355. But Max Fry found pollen samples that were from the Middle East, the area around Jerusalem, some, of course, from Europe. And so this helped to confirm the travels of the shroud before 1355. And he also found dust and dirt on the shroud, especially in the areas of the feet and the knees and the nose. And this dust or dirt matches exactly with the travertine aragonite, which is found in the grottos or the tomb areas outside of Jerusalem. So we'll be talking about that a little bit more too. So all of these pieces of information are starting to come together and starting to intrigue people. And one person who was very intrigued was an Air Force man, a physicist, who was interested in finding out more about the image properties. And he had access to a machine which is called a VP8 image analyzer. And this machine was developed in the 1970s, and it was designed to evaluate X-rays for imaging purposes. So it could take lights and darks that are in a two-dimensional image and convert them to three-dimensional images, vertical reliefs. So he took an image of the shroud and put it into this VP8 image analyzer, and this was in 1976. And what he discovered is that the shroud image contained three-dimensional information. So remember, this image is less than 2 nanometers thick, less than the thickness of a human hair, and yet he could get up to 4 centimeters of information about how the fabric draped the person it wrapped. So what he concluded is that there was distance information encoded in the fabric. So the three-dimensional information shows the distance from the body to the cloth. So let me explain that a little better. Remember when we wrapped Michael, you could see where the cloth touched his nose. You could see his nose, you could see his fingers, you could see his feet. And that is how the fabric was that wrapped the man of the shroud. So in the area of the nose, on the image, it looks darker, but it's not actually darker, it's just that more of those fibers are colored. So imagine if you had a piece of blank paper and you had one of those big giant magic markers that kids use that have just the round dots on them. If you put one dot here and one dot here and one dot here, you don't get a very full image. But if you start filling the dots in, it creates a darker image. It appears to be darker, but all of the areas are exactly the same. They're just more in the area where they're concentrated. So with the shroud, the area that was touching the fabric, there's more areas of the fabric that have discoloration in the image area. So that's what they discovered, is that there was three-dimensional information actually encoded in the fabric itself. And this was mind-boggling to these scientists because there is no other image that has these characteristics, that has the photonegative quality and also this three-dimensional information. So these scientists came together and formed the Shroud of Turin Research Project. So in 1978, there was a team of scientists, and I have 26 plus, because 26 scientists actually traveled to Turin and had hands-on time studying the shroud. And then there were many other scientists who reviewed their research and wrote reports afterwards. But there were 26 scientists, and they were given the opportunity to have 120 hours of uninterrupted time with the shroud to do whatever studies that they wanted to do, as long as they didn't damage the shroud in any way. So this was in 1978, and the scientists took 80 crates of the most leading edge equipment with them to do this study. And I know you can't read this, but that's a list of the scientists who went. And the reason why I included this slide is because it tells the background of these scientists. They were from like Sandia Labs and the Jet Propulsion Lab. They were from NASA. They were physicists with the American Air Force. These were top-notch scientists in their field. And this was not a religious quest. These scientists were there for one reason, and that was to understand how this image came to be on a linen cloth. That was their objective. They were from all different kinds of religious backgrounds. There were some Catholics, there were Protestants, there were agnostics, and there were even some atheists, and there were some very prominent Jews who were a part of this research team. And it wasn't a religious question. In fact, some of them, if you've ever heard Barry Schwartz talk, Barry was the documenting photographer for the STURP team. He says that he expected that he was getting a free trip to Italy, and that he would walk in and look at the shroud, and in 15 minutes he would be able to say, oh, this is obviously a painting. But instead, they did their 120 hours of research, and they left with more questions than they came with. Now, one question I always get is, how did I get interested in the shroud? Well, back in 1978, when the STURP team was formed, I was in high school in Boulder, Colorado, and there was a member of my church who was one of the STURP team members. His name is Rudy Dichtel, and he was in charge of setting up all of the equipment for the STURP team. And so when he came back after their study in Turin, he started giving presentations around Boulder, and my dad was very interested, so every time Rudy gave a presentation, my dad would go, and so I would always go along with my dad. And so Rudy was a physics professor at the University of Colorado, and when I started going to school there, every time I had to write a research paper, I would go and visit Rudy and say, what have you got? And he would give me his research before it was ever published in any of the peer-reviewed journals where it was subsequently published. So I've been a Shroudie since I was in high school, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, because I talk about the shroud all the time, and my family especially says, you need to find some more people to talk to about this. So thank you all for being here today. So this is just a list of some of the studies that the STURP team did. They did everything that they could do that wouldn't damage the shroud to gather more information. And then, after they did these studies, they came home and they studied some more, and they wrote their journal articles, and they published 20 peer-reviewed articles in journals, and they came up with their conclusion, which I'm going to read to you because it's very significant. They published this in 1981. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. So the top scientists in the world have studied the shroud, and this is the result. So the next thing that happened in the history of the shroud is that King Umberto, who was the owner of the shroud, he was the last king of Italy. He was deposed in World War II, so he was living in exile. But in his will, he deeded the shroud to the person of the Pope. And so this is a picture of King Umberto a year before he died with Pope John Paul II. And so when he died in 1983, the shroud became the property of the Pope. People are often surprised by this, that it was held in private ownership all the way up until very recent time. Today, the shroud remains in its chapel in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. And the next part of the shroud's history is the most problematic time in its history. And if people have only ever heard one thing about the shroud, they've probably heard about the radiocarbon dating that took place in 1988. I remember this very vividly because it was in all the newspapers around the world. So what happened is that there was a protocol established for doing a radiocarbon test on the shroud. And the protocol recommended that they take 7 samples from various places around the shroud, not from one place, and that it be sent to multiple laboratories, and that they use 2 different types of dating for the sampling, or I'm sorry, for the testing. But instead, what happened was 1 sample was cut, and it was divided up into 4 pieces. 1 piece was held in reserve, and then the other piece was cut into 3 smaller samples, and those 3 samples were sent to 3 laboratories, and 1 type of radiocarbon dating was. So a sample of 8 centimeters was cut in half, and then that 4 centimeters was cut into 3 samples and then sent to the labs. 1 lab in Zurich, 1 lab in Arizona, and then the 3rd lab was Oxford. And this whole process was overseen by the British Museum. So the area that they decided to sample, if you can see in this slide, it was this area at the upper right-hand corner of the shroud. The shroud had been displayed over 200 times, it's been documented, where it was put on display and it was handled by the bishops or the nobility who were privileged to hold it. It was held in exactly this area. And you can see where they cut the small sample. And the slide on your far right shows the area that fluoresces, bright green. That is where they cut the sample from. So this was a photograph that was taken in 1978 by the STIRP team using a fluorescent photography. And you can see that the color of the area is very different from the main body of the shroud. So when they published the results of the radiocarbon dating in 1988, the scientists said that they could prove with 95% certainty that the shroud fabric was from 1260 to 1390. And so therefore the shroud was a medieval forgery. And you'll remember I told you that when the shroud showed up in written history for the first time was 1355, right in the middle of this date range that they came up with. And this news was devastating in the shroud world. Before 1988, there were over 20 international centers that were studying the shroud. After 1988, research pretty much went dark. It was a very sad time in the shroud world. But in about 2000, people started talking about the shroud again because in 2017, there was a French researcher who was a law student, and he used the Freedom of Information Act to actually get the records from these 3 different laboratories so that he could look at the raw data about the radiocarbon dating. And so they finally released the raw data, and they analyzed the raw data statistically, and what they determined is that that small sample that was studied was not homogeneous. So the conclusion was that this area that was sampled was not representative of the fabric of the shroud. This was published in 2019, the magazine Archaeometry. So Archaeometry was one of the journals that published the original 1988 carbon dating results that have been so widely publicized. They published this article in 2019, which says definitively that the area that was sampled in 1988 was not representative of the entire fabric of the shroud. So we can put this question of radiocarbon dating to rest. Now, if there is a need for radiocarbon dating in the future, that will be up to the Pope to determine. But as it stands right now, radiocarbon dating requires that the sample be cut from the shroud and that it be destroyed. So unless there's another form of dating that's developed, I think it's probably unlikely that that would be agreed to. I'm going to back up to what I skipped over. In 2002, it was determined that the shroud needed to undergo some repairs. And you can see where those patches were, that when they cut open the patched areas, there were things underneath the patches from the fire, so areas where the fabric had been singed. And there were also dust mites that were collecting in those patched areas. So they removed the patches, they straightened out some of the fold marks in the shroud, and this is what it looks like today. So the top image is what it looked like before the 2002 restoration, and the bottom image is what it looks like today. The reason why it looks so strikingly different is because there had been a backing cloth that was on the old shroud, and that backing cloth was a little bit darker color. And so the contrast between the image and the background of the fabric was greater with that backing cloth. Now there's a lighter color backing cloth, and so the image is a little bit harder to see. But you can get a better sense of how beautiful the fabric actually is. The linen is still in remarkably good shape, and it's beautiful to see. You can see those areas with the circle. That's where the radiocarbon dating sample was taken. So the image on the top is before the radiocarbon dating, and the image on the bottom is after. Another recent development is that in 2004, there were some tombs that were discovered in Masada, and that was the area, the holdout of the Jewish people when they were conquered by the Romans in 72 AD. And they found some fabrics that had wrapped the bodies in these burial places, and they found this stitching on those tombs that they know are from 72 AD. And the only other place where they've seen this exact stitch is on the side strip that's on the Shroud of Turin. So this was also very significant because it helps to date the shroud to the time period of those Masada tombs of AD 72. So today, as I said, the shroud remains in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. It's in a very special box that's been built for it. It's laid flat, stored flat, and it's in a temperature-controlled environment. It's under bulletproof glass, and it has argon gas in its atmosphere so that it doesn't deteriorate, and it has just a tiny bit of oxygen so that bacteria doesn't grow. And it's kept in this location all the time. It's monitored 24/7. And the last thing I want to mention about the shroud, as I've already said, it's the single most studied artifact in the history of the world, and it's created an entirely new field of study, which is known as syndenology. And syndenology incorporates all kinds of areas of science: chemistry, physics, geology, and then also art history, history in general. So there's all of these fields of study that have developed around looking at the shroud and trying to understand its properties. So there's three main areas that scientists are actively working on today. One is they're trying to understand more about the blood. And one question I always get is there DNA on the shroud? And yes, there is DNA because it's been handled by many, many people over the years. And the blood does contain DNA, but it's very degraded. So hopefully science will continue to evolve and that there will be more information to be able to be gathered about the blood. Another area of study is about the pollen, to see what we can learn about the history of the shroud from the pollen and dust on the shroud. And then the most important study is trying to understand this enigmatic image. How was this image formed? And what can we learn about Jesus by learning more about this image? So there are currently some prominent theories about how this image was formed. And again, these are theories. They haven't been proven, but they all revolve around this idea that there was a very, very short burst of very intense light. And it would have been low heat light, because if it had been a high heat light, it would have burned up the fabric itself. So the theories are that the body itself radiated the light, and that from this low heat, very fast, high intensity burst of light, the image was imprinted on the fabric. So this is an area of study. The scientists are actively working on this as we speak. But again, it's just a hypothesis at this point. So what does the Catholic Church say about the shroud? The church doesn't have an official stance on the shroud. Saint Pope John Paul II visited in 1998, and he said that the church entrusts scientists the task of continuing to investigate so that satisfactory answers may be found to the questions concerning this sheet. So that is what we are going to turn to in just a moment. So there's widespread agreement among scientists, Jews, agnostics, atheists, that the Shroud of Turin is a representation of Jesus of Nazareth, and it represents what Jesus endured. Now, if we believe that Jesus is God's Son, or if Jesus is the Messiah, this is a question of faith. And that's what we're going to turn to for the next part of the presentation. But I'm going to tell you one thing that always stands out to me when I see this picture of the tomb with the stone rolled away. And it reminds me of when I was a little girl, and around Easter time when we would see the tomb and see the stone rolled away, I always thought, well, that stone was rolled away so that Jesus could get out. But now that I've been studying the shroud for most of my life, I recognize that the stone is rolled away so that we can look in. And that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of this time. We're going to look in, and we're going to see that the body of Jesus is not there, but he left something behind for us, something that helps us to understand his passion, his death, and his resurrection in a much more meaningful way. And I was raised in a faithful home, and we had a crucifix on the wall, and I got very used to seeing the crucified body of Jesus in my house, and we're used to seeing the corpus on a cross in the church. And so what I want to do is to try to bring your attention to some of the features of the crucifixion that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. But the focus of this second half of the presentation is not just these gruesome details about Jesus' suffering, but it's about why he suffered. And the Gospels tell us very clearly why Jesus suffered, and probably the most quoted scripture of the New Testament, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. So that is the point of talking about the shroud. And I feel just such a compulsion to talk about the shroud with people. And a lot of times when I have these presentations, especially when they're with younger people, they come up to me afterwards and they say, how come nobody ever told me this? Because it's so crucial to our faith to understand these things. So I'm so glad you're here, and I hope that you'll have this passion to go out and share this information with other people too. St. Catherine of Siena said that the nails were not enough to hold God and man nailed and fastened on the cross, had not love held him there first. So we're going to look at what Jesus suffered, and the shroud is going to give us a lot of information about what Jesus suffered. But we have to turn to the scriptures to understand why he suffered those things. So we have two things together here. We have the documents, which is the scripture, but we also have the monuments, which is the shroud itself. And that's the gold standard for historians, to have a document and a monument that tell the same story. And that's what we have here today. So to begin, we're going to start at the end. We're going to start with the empty tomb, and we're going to remember the scriptures that we read on every Easter Sunday. It's from the Gospel of John. And it tells us that early on the morning of the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, and she saw that the tomb had been removed from the entrance. So she went running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, which is John, and she said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." So Mary Magdalene's first thought was that tomb raiders had come and they had taken the body away. So Peter and the other disciple started running for the tomb. And that's what we see in this picture here. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. I love this gospel passage because we get just a little sense of John's personality. He wants you to know that he got there first. And so we kind of see Peter running up a little bit behind him. And so John tells us that he bent over and he looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. Because remember, John is a young man at this time, and he's probably deferential to his elder Peter, but he might have also been a little nervous about what is happening here. But the scriptures tell us that he bent in and he looked, and he saw the strips of linen lying there. And then we hear Peter huffing and puffing coming up behind John. And of course, he doesn't stop. He goes right on in. And he also saw the strips of linen lying there. And so then we have John telling us that he went in, he saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. We have two cloths here in John's gospel. We have the linen, and then we have the headcloth that was folded up and separate from the linen. And then we hear John talk about himself. He says, finally, the other disciple, he makes a big point of this, the one who had reached the tomb first, he also went inside. And John says about himself, he saw and believed. So at that moment, when John went into the empty tomb, saw those linens lying there, he understood at that moment everything that Jesus had been teaching him. So there must have been something very significant about that linen cloth that was lying there. The way that the scriptures read, it's that the cloth was there, as if it had been collapsed. Imagine like a balloon where all the air had been let out of the balloon, and then the cloth just settled down. And John's gospel tells us that he was there at the foot of the cross. He saw Jesus dead, and he saw him put into the tomb. And now he sees the dirty linen left behind, but no body. So what do we make of that? Some people have called the Shroud of Turin the fifth gospel, because it tells us so much information that's not written down in the scriptures. And this last weekend, I heard a very prominent speaker, Emanuela Marinelli from Rome, talk about the shroud, and she calls the shroud a gospel written in blood. And during this time of Lent, it helps us to really deepen our meditation so that we can look forward to the joyous celebration of the resurrection. But to get there, we need to go back and to understand why Jesus was in Jerusalem in the first place. So Jesus was a faithful Jew, and he had traveled to Jerusalem as a part of the great pilgrimage feast of the Passover. And I put the slide up here. I don't know if you can see it or not, but there are a lot of little teeny tiny people in that slide. And that's because historians say that between 100 and 200,000 people came to Jerusalem every year to celebrate the Feast of the Passover. And this was one of the great pilgrimage feasts for the Jewish people every year. And they would come with the purpose of making atonement for their sins and to commemorate the Exodus out of Egypt. So I'm going to give you just a quick reminder of what the Passover feast is all about. So back in the time of Moses, the Israelites were enslaved to the Egyptians, and Moses kept going to Pharaoh saying, let my people go, and Pharaoh would say, no, no, no. And so God sent a series of plagues on the people of Egypt. And you'll remember there were frogs and boils, and the river ran red with blood, and so all of these terrible things happened, and yet Pharaoh kept saying, no, you can't go, you can't leave. So finally, the 9th plague was a darkness came over the entire land of Egypt. And so this was a darkness, the scriptures tell us it was so deep you could feel it, just a complete and utter darkness. And then the 10th plague was that the angel of death would come and kill the firstborn of every household. And the only remedy to preserve your household from this angel of death was to sacrifice a perfect, unblemished lamb and take the blood of that lamb and put it on your doorposts, so that when the angel of death came over your house, it would see this blood of the perfect lamb and your household would be protected. So this shedding of the blood of the perfect lamb is crucial to understanding Jesus' sacrifice. And you'll remember in the beginning of John's gospel, when John the Baptist sees Jesus for the first time, he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And we say this every single time we come to Mass at the institution of the Eucharist. When the priest turns and looks at the people and lifts up the chalice and the consecrated bread, these are the words that the priest said. He's repeating these words of St. John the Baptist. "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." So that's why Jesus, as a faithful Jew, had come into Jerusalem to celebrate this feast of the Passover. And the meal that we call the Last Supper was his celebration of this feast with his friends. And that's when he instituted the Eucharist. And right now in the church, we have this 3-year celebration of the Eucharist. And so it's so appropriate to talk about the shroud in relationship to the Eucharist, because we see the blood of Jesus actually poured out on the shroud, which is part of the elements of the Eucharist that we celebrate. So we're going to move from Jesus celebrating this meal with his friends to Jesus going out into the Garden of Gethsemane. And in the sorrowful mysteries, we call this the agony in the garden. And so Jesus goes into the garden to pray. And this is where the passion of Jesus really begins, is in this garden. And the Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus was praying in the garden, and he was under so much distress that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. And this is a medical condition that's known to doctors today. It's called hematidrosis. And it's a condition where the capillaries burst and the blood squeezes through the pores in the skin and comes out through the pores like drops of blood. And not only is this a condition where the blood is on the skin, but it makes the skin, which is the largest organ in the body, extremely sensitive to touch. And so when we see Judas coming to betray Jesus, and he betrays him with the kiss, this kiss on the face of Jesus wasn't just painful because of the betrayal, the psychological ramifications of being betrayed by his friend. It was also painful because of this hematidrosis. And all of the suffering of his rest of his passion was magnified by this intense mental anguish that he endured during in the Garden of Gethsemane. So the Gospels tell us that Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, and he betrayed him with a kiss. Now, if you've ever wondered why Judas needed to identify Jesus to the authorities, it's because of all those pilgrims who had come into Jerusalem who were there to celebrate the feast. So Judas went to the authorities and said that he would identify Jesus for them. And so they come, and these are the Jewish authorities who come and arrest Jesus in the garden, and they take him away in chains. And Jesus says to them, "I've been preaching in the synagogue all of this time, and yet here you come and take me away like I'm a criminal." So these are the Jewish leaders, and the scriptures tell us that between midnight and 6 a.m. in the morning, he was put on trial. And at these different trials, he was mocked, he was beaten, and then he was ultimately condemned to death. So one of the first trials is Jesus is taken before the high priest. And the high priest that year was a man named Caiaphas. And so Jesus comes before Caiaphas, and the scriptures tell us that he's trying to find 2 witnesses who agree to what his crimes are, because in the Jewish law, they had to have 2 witnesses agree. But the witnesses kept changing their story. They would say different things. They did not agree with each other. So finally, Caiaphas turns to Jesus, and he asks him point blank, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus said to him, "I am." In the Gospel of Mark, he uses those words that are the Hebrews' understanding of who Jesus is, or who God is, the I am. And Jesus continues on and he says, "But I say to you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." So this is a quote from Daniel in the Old Testament, and the Jewish people would have known that Jesus was saying, not only is he the Messiah, but he is also God's son. Two things. And Caiaphas recognized this as blasphemy, and he rips his clothes, and he says, what more proof do we need? We don't need any witnesses to agree to each other. He has condemned himself. But in Jewish law, the penalty for blasphemy is stoning. And because the Jewish people were under Roman control, they did not have the right to put somebody to death. So Caiaphas needed to take Jesus in front of the Roman authority, who was Pontius Pilate, and convince Pontius Pilate that Jesus needed to be put to death. But before he did that, Caiaphas and the Jewish leaders who were there started mocking Jesus, and they started hitting him and beating him in the face. And I'm going to warn you, there's some very graphic slides here. This is from a sculpture that was made by a Spanish artist, and it's very graphic, showing the wounds of the Passion. But I just want to emphasize that these were the Jewish leaders who are overseeing this beating of Jesus. And during this trial, the so-called trial, when the Jewish leaders are saying they're beating Jesus in the face, and they're telling him to prophesy. And meanwhile, in the courtyard, right next to them, Peter is denying Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus had prophesied a few hours before. So the Jewish leaders are mocking him, saying, prophesy, and yet his prophecy is being fulfilled at the same time as Peter is sitting by the fire and denying Jesus, just as Jesus said he would. So the shroud tells us that the man of the shroud received an intense beating, and his right cheekbone and eyes are swollen, and also his nose is clearly broken. And I told you that my friend Rudy was the reason why I started becoming interested in the shroud, and he told me this story, that when he was alone one night with the shroud, he was looking at the face of the man of the shroud and pondering this face that was so beaten. And he said, well, his nose is clearly broken, so he can't be Jesus, because the perfect sacrifice had to be an unblemished lamb with no broken bones. And then he said he realized that the nose is cartilage and it's not a broken bone. And so that was the moment where he felt fully convinced that this truly was Jesus the Messiah. We also see, as I mentioned, that the beard has been plucked out in the center, and this fulfills Isaiah 50, where it says, I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out my beard. So the Jewish leaders send Jesus over to Pilate, and Pilate doesn't think there's anything wrong with Jesus saying that he's the Son of God. Pilate doesn't mind about that. So the Jewish leaders tell Pilate that Jesus is also saying he's the King of the Jews. Now this is something that concerns Pilate, because they have no king but Caesar. And so this is a charge of insurrection. And so Pilate is trying to find a way to protect Jesus, because he doesn't find any fault with him. He doesn't want to have Jesus put to death. In fact, Pilate says 3 different times, I find no fault with this man. And we see Pilate going through all these gymnastics trying to find a way to rescue Jesus from being crucified. The first thing he tries is he finds out Jesus is a Galilean, and he knows that Herod is in town, and Herod is the hereditary king of the Jews. He is from the area of Galilee, and he has come into Jerusalem also for this pilgrimage feast to celebrate the Passover. So Pilate sends Jesus over to meet with Herod. And Herod is very eager to meet Jesus because he's heard about him, and he wants Jesus to perform some miracles for him. But the scriptures tell us, in fulfillment of Isaiah 53, that Jesus did not open his mouth. The scripture says that he stands there silent like a lamb, or like a sheep before the shears. He opened not his mouth. So Herod was disappointed, and he sent Jesus back to Pilate, and the scriptures tell us that Herod and Pilate became friends that day because both of them could find no fault with Jesus. So here we have those two witnesses that we were looking for back at the first trial. These witnesses agree that Jesus was not at fault. So the next technique that Pilate tries to free Jesus is he offers to release a prisoner, because for the Feast of the Passover, traditionally, they release somebody that the people call for. And so Pilate offers to release either Jesus or Barabbas. Now, the name Barabbas is Bar Abba, which means son of the Father. So here we have this setup between the Son of the Father, the true Son of the Father, Jesus, and this true insurrectionist, Bar Abba, Barabbas. And people choose the criminal to be released. And so they release Barabbas, and then they turn Jesus over for further punishment. So Pilate has one more option, and that is to have Jesus scourged. Now, this is where we get a lot of information from the shroud that are not in the Gospels. The technique of scourging was used three different ways. One was just as a punishment in itself, so the victim could be scourged, and typically that person would be scourged within an inch of their life, but then released. And historians seem to think this is what Pilate was trying to do, was to have Jesus viciously scourged, but then be released. Another option with scourging is to be the ultimate punishment and result in death. And then the third was to have it be a prelude to crucifixion. And the problem with being a prelude to crucifixion is that the scourger had to be careful not to kill the victim, because scourging was so brutal, and the Roman centurions who performed the scourging needed to make sure that the victim made it all the way to the point of crucifixion. So the Gospels don't tell us very much about the scourging, but the shroud tells us a lot. The Gospels say in John, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And in Matthew it says, Pilate released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. But the shroud tells us a lot more information. There are approximately 365 independent wounds associated with the scourging. There's 152 on the front and 213 on the back. So the scourging wasn't just limited to the back. And we're also very used to seeing Jesus with a modesty cloth in all of our depictions of him on the cross. But the reality is that he was stripped naked. And the scourge marks are all over his body, including the buttocks and the pelvic region. And the shroud shows us that the scourging was inflicted with a Roman flagrum. And the Roman flagrum was a wooden handle about 18 inches long with 3 leather straps. And then at the end of the straps were barbell-shaped weights that were designed to puncture the skin and to lacerate the skin. So a lot of times when we think about the whipping of Jesus, we think about it as a Jewish whipping with just the leather straps. But the Roman flagrum was something entirely different. It was designed to cut away the flesh and to disable or even to kill the victim. So this is that sculpture again, and you can see all of the wounds from the scourge marks on here. And I put this up here because I think this picture reminds me of the Isaiah 53, where we see the suffering servant, where it says, by his stripes we are healed. And Isaiah was written 700 years before Jesus was born, and yet it very graphically details what Jesus endured for us. The other result of the scourging is that the victim would lose a great deal of blood and so start to go into hypovolemic shock for the blood supply being depleted. And then also there would be a buildup of fluid around the heart. So in the pericardium around the heart, fluid would start to build up, putting pressure on the heart, making it more difficult for the heart to pump. So after Pilate turned Jesus over, after the brutal scourging, we see that Jesus is taken in front of a cohort of Roman soldiers, and they also take their turn at mocking him. Now, a cohort of soldiers is somewhere between 300 and 600 soldiers that were making fun of Jesus and taunting him. And the scriptures tell us that the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. Now, I've heard some theologians say that this is the most convincing evidence that the man of the shroud is Jesus, because there's only one person in recorded history who was crowned with thorns and also crucified, and that's Jesus of Nazareth. The other thing that's so convincing about the thorns on the shroud is that it's not a crown of thorns like we're used to seeing. It's actually a cap of thorns, or some people call it a helmet of thorns. So what theologians think happened is that one of these Roman soldiers with a gloved hand went outside of the place where they were holding Jesus and came across this plant, which is known as the Gundelia tourneforti. And this plant has thorns on it that are 1 to 2 inches long, and it blooms in the springtime in the area around Jerusalem. And so this soldier probably went out, got a clump of these thorns and cut it off, and came back and shoved it into Jesus' head. So it wasn't a nice circlet that just went around his forehead. It was actually a cap that covered the whole of his head and punctured through the skin all the way down to the bony plate of his skull. And the shroud shows us that there are 52 independent wounds associated with the thorns on the top of the head and also on the nape of the neck. So I want to just take a minute and talk, why was Jesus crowned with thorns? We are so used to seeing that when we look at our crucifixes that we don't often stop and think about why was this important? What's the theological significance of Jesus being crowned with thorns? So to understand this, we have to go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And we remember that Adam and Eve were given this beautiful garden, and they were told that they could eat of any fruit in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But of course we know that they sinned, they disobeyed God, and that when God came looking for them and said that the penalty of their sin would be that the land would be cursed because of their sin, and from now on, the land would produce thorns and thistles. So we see right off the bat in Genesis that the consequence of sin is thorns and thistles. Then we move forward in Genesis and we see that Abraham is taking his son Isaac to be offered as a sacrifice. Abraham doesn't understand why God has required this of him, but he's obedient. And we see Isaac carrying the wood of his sacrifice on his back himself, going up to the mountain where he's going to potentially be sacrificed. And Isaac asks his father, where is the sacrifice? Where is what we're going to kill to offer to God? And Abraham says to Isaac, his son, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. And so they proceed up the mountain, and Abraham gets prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac, and the angel stops him. And they turn and they look and they see not a lamb, but a ram caught in a thicket. So the horns of the ram are wrapped in thorns and thistles in the thicket. And that is the sacrifice that's provided, not the lamb yet. And so then we move forward to Moses and the law that is given to Moses by God himself. And one of the other great pilgrimage feasts for the Jewish people is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. There are a lot of things that happen on Yom Kippur, but one of the significant events is that the high priest takes 2 goats, and one goat is liberated and set free, and the other goat becomes the scapegoat. And the high priest puts his hands on the head of the scapegoat and puts all the sins of all the people of Israel on the head of that goat and then sends it out into the desert. So we see that the goat is the sin bearer bearing the sins of the people on its head. And so now we turn to Jesus with this crown of thorns on his head, this cap of thorns. And we see all of this come together, that Jesus is the Lamb of God, just like John said he was. He's the perfect sacrifice. He's carrying all the sins of the world on his head in this thicket of thorns. So the scriptures tell us that Jesus was led out to the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. Now we're used to seeing Jesus carrying the whole T cross, but the reality is that he only carried the crossbeam, the patibulum. And this is because it would have been way too heavy. It was just the patibulum was between 75 and 125 pounds. And so that was put on his shoulders, and he was led out, and he most likely was tied to the wood of the cross so that he had no way to break a fall if he were to stumble and fall on his way to the place of execution. So the shroud tells us the same story, that Jesus carried a heavy object on his shoulders because those scourge marks are abraded underneath the right shoulder blade and then also the left shoulder blade. So the right shoulder and the left shoulder blade have been abraded by something rubbing, the heavy wood of the cross rubbing on those wounds as he made his way. And we see in the Gospels that Jesus had to be helped. So the Synoptic Gospels all tell us that Simon of Cyrene had to step in and help Jesus. And in Luke, we get the detail that Simon had the cross laid on him to carry it behind Jesus. And this is exactly the image that Jesus gave to his followers earlier on. He said, if you want to follow me, you must take up your cross. And we see Simon is this perfect example of discipleship, taking up his cross and following behind Jesus. So in the Stations of the Cross, we have a tradition that Jesus fell 3 times on his way to Calvary. Now, it's not recorded in the scriptures that he fell, but it is recorded on the shroud. There are wounds at his knees and also on his nose. And so the scientists think that because his hands were tied to the wood of this cross, he had no way to break his fall. When he would fall forward on his chest, and his face would fall into the dirt. And that's where we see those traces of that dirt, that is that travertine aragonite limestone that is only found in the areas around the tombs in Jerusalem. We can imagine Jesus carrying this heavy crossbeam and falling, and it's a picture of Jesus carrying all the sins of the world on his back and the weight of them crushing him as he makes his way to the cross. The 10th station of the cross, we remember that Jesus was stripped of his clothes, and this was in preparation for the crucifixion. So again, this is an important theological point, that he was naked, because remember, Jesus is taking us back to the garden. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were naked before God without shame. And now we see Jesus undoing the knot of sin that was created by Adam and Eve. And he is naked in the shroud and naked as he's nailed to the cross. And he's naked without shame as he's undoing this sinful nature. We have 3 marks of crucifixion that are shown on the shroud. There are the wounds at the wrist and then also the wounds in the feet. And the scriptures tell us very little about the actual crucifixion of Jesus. All it really says is that he was taken out and he was crucified along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. We have in the servant song in Isaiah 53 where it says, I have carved you on the palms of my hands. And remember, Isaiah was written 700 years before Jesus was born, but it was also written 200 years before crucifixion was even invented. And yet Isaiah gives us a picture of what the Messiah will suffer on our behalf. And we get this term excruciating from crucifixion because crucifixion was designed to be a form of torture and humiliation. And it was so painful that Roman citizens could not be crucified. It was the worst form of punishment. It was reserved for slaves and insurrectionists. And as Jesus is being nailed to the cross, the Gospel of Luke tells us that he was praying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." And the translation of this doesn't capture the truth of what Jesus was praying. He didn't just pray it once. He was praying it over and over and over again. "Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them." So the shroud shows us that the nails went through the wrist. And as I told you before, Pierre Barbet discovered that the palms could not support the weight of the body. But there is a place here, if you bring your thumb and your pinky finger together, there's a spot here at the base of your thumb called the place of destote. And a nail could go through that place, and the bones of the wrist would actually open up. The nail could be driven through that space, and then the nails would come back together and hold the wrist fastened securely to the cross, and it could support the weight of the body. The other aspect of being nailed through this area is that the median and the ulnar nerves run through this portion of the hand, and once those nerves are severed, it causes the thumbs to be drawn strongly into the palms of the hands, and there are no thumbs visible on the shroud. So then the next thing is that the victim would be lifted up on the cross, and then the feet would be nailed to the cross. Now, this is not confirmed if there was one nail or two nails. It's really not known how Jesus' feet were nailed to the cross. We're used to seeing, as on this crucifix, one nail through both feet, but it could have possibly have been two nails. It's not known. And the reason why is because once someone was crucified, once the body was taken down from the cross, the nails were taken out and reused. The body was typically thrown into a pit, and the nails were reused for the next victim. There have only been 2 cases where there have been crucifixion victims found with the nails still in the bones. So scientists are trying to reconstruct how crucifixion actually could take place. But one thing that's known about crucifixion is that the knees were bent. And the reason why the knees were bent is because when the body was hanging from the wrists, in a lower position, the person could only passively inhale. And in order to exhale the air from the lungs, they would have to push up against the nails in their feet in order to be able to exhale. So that's the situation for the crucifixion victim. They died from asphyxiation because once they became too exhausted and they could no longer push up and exhale, they would stay in the lower position and finally die from asphyxiation. So the scriptures tell us that Jesus was nailed to the cross between 9 a.m. and noon, and that he hung on the cross for somewhere between 3 and 6 hours. And the scriptures tell us that at the last, he cried out in a loud voice. One of the scriptures says that. John says, and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So we see Jesus on the cross. He's still talking. He's taking care of his mother, making sure she's cared for. He's ministering to the people around him, talking to the good thief. So we don't see Jesus struggling with asphyxiation at this point. And scientists have wondered about that. How could he cry out in a loud voice if the mechanism for death from crucifixion is asphyxiation? And what doctors, forensic doctors, think is that because Jesus had had so much repeated beatings on his back and his chest, that the pressure had built up in his pleural cavity, putting more and more pressure on his heart, and it would have increased the workload on his heart and would ultimately cause a rupture in the wall around his heart and lead to a sudden death. So in essence, we see that Jesus died of a broken heart. So in case there was any question as to whether or not Jesus was really dead, the Roman soldier who was at the foot of the cross thrust his spear into his side. And this is probably the most important theological point that I want to stress with you here today, because John is very clear about this in his gospel. John writes, "One of the soldiers thrust a lance into his side, and immediately a flow of blood and water came forth. An eyewitness has testified to this." So John is talking about himself. He's an eyewitness. And he says his testimony is true. And he knows that what he says is true. And the reason why John is writing this is so that we will believe. Now, this has been something that people have wondered about over time. How could blood and water flow from the side of Jesus? But it's clear on the shroud that there was blood and water that flowed forth from the side of Jesus. And this didn't become evident until 1978, when the shroud was photographed using ultraviolet light for the first time. And what was discovered is that the side wound where Jesus' heart was perforated between the 5th and 6th rib, that there was a profusion of blood that poured out, but around that blood is a halo of clear serous fluid that's not visible to the naked eye. It was only visible when it was finally photographed using the ultraviolet fluorescent photography in 1978. And the reason for this separation is that this is post-mortem blood. So the Roman soldier pierced Jesus in the side, and the shroud shows us that the sword that was used was the Roman lancia, which was common for all of the soldiers to be issued this lancia, and that this is what they used in their battle, and that he pierced his heart. And as we've been talking about, there was all of this fluid that had built up. Because Jesus was already dead, the heavy red corpuscles settled to the bottom, and the clear liquid serum came to the top, so that when Jesus' side was opened up, water and blood did pour forth. And you just have to remember Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman at the well, saying that I will give you streams of living water. And the Old Testament says that living water will come forth from the side of the temple. And we see Jesus here as the new temple, and from his side is coming this blood and water. And in the Catholic Church, we remember this in the institution of the sacraments, the waters of our baptism, and then the blood of the Eucharist. And we see both of these things here on the shroud. So this is the UV fluorescent photography. So Jesus is taken down from the cross, and the Gospels tell us that this rich man, Joseph of Arimathea, purchased a linen cloth and asked for permission to bury Jesus' body. And so he was placed in the tomb that was prepared for Joseph himself. And the traditional attire for the priest, when he was going into the Holy of Holies to make sacrifices on behalf of the people, he dressed in a pure linen garment, and he went before the presence of God to make sacrifices on behalf of the people, dressed in this pure linen garment. So we see Jesus dressed like a priest, but laid into this new tomb that was fit for a king. So he's buried like a priest and a king. So the body, it's wrapped in the shroud. It's in rigor mortis, and rigor mortis reaches its peak about 12 hours after death, and then within 30 to 36 hours after death, it starts to relax again. So the body is still in rigor mortis at the time when the image is formed. So we know that Jesus is laid in the tomb, wrapped in the linen cloth. And I'm going to have to come back to the sudarium if we have questions about that, the face cloth. But we see Jesus is in the tomb on Holy Saturday. He's obedient even in death. He keeps holy the Sabbath, rests on the Sabbath. And then we know the story does not end with his dead body laying in the tomb. We know that on the morning of Easter Sunday, sometime between midnight and 6 a.m., he is resurrected and his body is transformed. And as we started with this talk, we see that the transfiguration gives us a glimpse of that glorification of his body. And we see in the shroud, in the image of the man of the shroud, just that moment, just before he opens his eyes into this new resurrected life. And Jesus is the first fruits. This is what he tells us. He's the first fruits, but this is the promise for all who believe in him, that we will be resurrected and live our lives in eternity with him in a resurrected, glorified body. So I'm going to close with the words of the sermon of Pope St. John Paul II when he visited the Shroud in 1998. So if you'll just join me in a moment of prayer, this is what Pope John Paul said. For the believer, what counts above all is that the shroud is a mirror of the gospel. The shroud does not hold people's hearts to itself, but points them to Jesus, the true word of the Father. The shroud invites us to rediscover the ultimate reason for Jesus' redeeming death. In the incomparable suffering that it documents, the love of the one who so loved the world that he gave his only Son is made almost tangible and reveals its astonishing dimensions. In its presence, believers can only exclaim in all truth, Lord, you could not love me more. Amen. So I tried to leave time for some questions, and I did skip over a few things, but I want to say that I have been working on this project at the National Museum of Funeral History, and there's some volunteers here, and they've handed out some brochures. So if you didn't receive a brochure and you would like one, Mary Jane is here, and they'll pass them out for you. And this exhibit is it'll be open to the public April 27th. So one little fact about the exhibit that's very exciting is that the authorities in Turin gifted to the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston a replica of the shroud. And this replica was printed, a high-definition printed image of the shroud on what is called old linen. And this linen was flax that was grown during COVID in 2020 in Bergamo, Italy. They took heirloom flax seeds out of the International Seed Vault in Sweden, and they grew this flax, and then they manufactured the linen using first-century techniques. And the fabric itself is absolutely beautiful. And then it's a high-definition image that's printed on this old linen. And this has been gifted to our archdiocese from the Archdiocese of Turin. And so that's going to be the centerpiece of the exhibit at the museum when it opens. So I hope that you will all come and see it. And I want to thank you again for having me, and I'm very happy to answer questions. I did skip over a few things, so and if you need to leave, I certainly understand that also. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you all. I appreciate it. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has questions. I know there was a question. Yes?
Would you speak a little bit about Facebook?
Yes, thank you for asking that. I'm sorry I had to skip over that. So the face cloth we talked about in John's Gospel, he said that there was the cloth covering the face was folded up and separate. So there is this face cloth which is known as the sudarium. And the word sudarium means handkerchief or sweat cloth. And so what happened is that after Jesus died, this cloth was put over his face to protect his mother from the disfigurement of his face. So you can imagine he was badly beaten. There was fluid coming out of his nose, out of his mouth, out of his ears from all of the beatings. And so this sudarium was wrapped around his face. And so when he was taken down from the cross, the face was covered, But when he was wrapped in the shroud, this face cloth was taken off and folded up, but it was kept with the body because this blood, this fluid was post-mortem fluid, and for the Jewish people it was very important to keep the blood together with the body. And so the sudarium was folded up and kept with the body, but it was separate. So the sudarium it has blood on it, it has the pleural fluid on it, but it does not have an image. It only has the blood stains. And they match exactly with the blood stains on the shroud.
Jesus died by cardiac arrest, not asphyxiation.
Yes, that's right. So remember, Pilate was very surprised that Jesus had died so quickly. In fact, the scriptures tell us that the soldiers had to break the legs of the people that were crucified with Jesus. And the reason why they broke the legs is because they clubbed them between the ankle and the knee, and once their legs were broken, they could no longer push themselves up to exhale. So they would die very quickly. And the scriptures tell us that Jesus' legs were not broken, and of course that's in fulfillment of the scriptures that he's the perfect lamb and none of his bones shall be broken. But it was surprising that he died so quickly, but it probably was a result of the vicious scourging that he had endured. And so he died quickly as a result of that. So thank you again for having me. Thank you.